Hey, how's it going everyone? This is YLAM here. In today's video, we're going to be going over the menu system for the Fuji X-T30. Keep in mind that this is a very basic introductory into the menu systems. I will be trying to go over almost every point, but I'm not going to go through every one of them because, to be honest with you, I don't change everything in the menu settings when I'm using my X-T30, but we will go over the vast majority of all of the menu settings. So let's go ahead and get started because there's definitely a lot to go through. The first one that we're going to see when we go into the menu system is you get to choose your menu size. I personally like 16:9 because pretty much all of the images I actually put on the internet, and 16:9 is the standard. Image quality is the next one. I always like to do fine plus raw because I always like the flexibility of having a JPEG and also having a raw image so that I can actually edit them whenever I want to. When it comes to raw recording, I like to go to lossless compressed. If we actually go out to the main menu, you'll notice that we can take 328 pictures. But if we go ahead and put it onto lossless compressed, what you'll notice is that we actually bump up to 520, which means that's quite a lot of additional pictures that we can actually take. So lossless compress is what I like to do. The compromise that you're going to have with lossless compress is that when you actually import those images into your computer, it's going to take a little bit longer because your computer is going to have to decompress it. In terms of the default film simulation that I usually use Velvia or Astia. Those are the two film simulations that I like to use. I'll just, for the sake of this one, put it in Velvia. I don't touch grain effects. I don't touch the chroma effect. White balance, I usually keep this on auto. Otherwise, I can flip down here and use one of the presets. But for the most part, for what I do for photography, I go ahead and just keep it in the auto setting, which is perfectly fine. For dynamic range, I like to keep it in auto, but for anybody who doesn't like the camera deciding for you, DR 100% is definitely good for bright light situations, and for low light situations like taking pictures in the dark, I usually go ahead and go down to DR 400 because in order to use DR 400, your base ISO is going to be at 640, whereas with DR 100, your base ISO is going to be, I believe for this camera, it's going to be 160, somewhere around there. So basically 100 will allow you to get to the lowest ISO. But for the most part, I usually don't mind just keeping it in auto and letting the camera decide for me. Range priority, I leave that at 0. For highlights, shadow tones, colors, and sharpness, you can definitely play with that, but I just leave it at the defaults, and if I really need to change any type of tone settings, I go ahead and do it in the RAWs because it's just much easier to do it in post. Color space, I leave it in RGB. Don't change anything for pixel mapping. Select custom settings. Here, I don't really change anything. Saving your custom settings. If you do use custom settings, you definitely do want to save them. Focus area, I leave it right at this. For focus modes, I usually like to do zone or single point. That's the setting that I like the most. Custom settings, this is where you can go through each of the custom settings. I usually just leave mine on all purpose, but you definitely want to come in here and read through every one of these because there are certain settings in here that's going to be good for certain purposes. Stored AF mode orientations, I go ahead and leave that off. AF point display, go ahead and leave that off. Number of focus points, a lot of people like having additional focus points. I personally like to simplify it and just leave it at 117 just because there's less focus points to go through. But if you go ahead and go to the 125, what you'll notice is that in here you're going to have a whole lot more focus points to work with, but I personally like it at 117 because there's just a lot less focus points that have to move in between, but you do have to do a little bit of focus and recomposing. Pre-AF, I leave that off. The Illuminator, which is the light up in front, if you're trying to autofocus in low light, it'll actually turn on the light. I'd leave that off. Most people do. For face detection, a lot of people like to turn that on. I personally keep that off because I don't really take a lot of pictures of faces, and sometimes that kicks on when I'm actually taking pictures and I don't want to actually focus in on a face, so I just go ahead and leave that off. AF plus MF, I go ahead and leave that off. Manual assist, this is when you actually put your camera into manual mode for focusing. What I really like to do for peak focusing, I always like the red high because it gives you a nice outline in red, which is a lot easier to see. Focus checking, leave that off, leave that turned on in the manual defaults. Instant AF settings, AF single, that's where I like it. Depth of field scales, I go ahead and keep it at pixels. release, I go ahead and just leave that at defaults. Touchscreen modes. This is an interesting one because a lot of people, they like to actually use the touchscreens, but for the most part, I personally don't like having the touchscreen on. That's because I usually have my eye next to the eyepiece, and if this is actually active, what happens is that I accidentally will move my focus points. So for me and for how I like to shoot, I actually like to have that off. Going into the drive settings right here, these are the settings for your bracket shooting, your high burst shooting, your low burst shooting, and your both filters. I generally don't change anything in here, but I am going to be trying to do more bracket shooting. And in my case, the two that I really want to try is the different film simulations, and I also want to try different dynamic ranges. So I will try to play around with the bracketing more in the future, but for high burst mode and low burst mode, I keep those at 5 and 8. They're perfectly fine. I don't really generally change anything for my advanced filters because I just don't use the advanced filters because those filter effects aren't really attractive to me. So I just stay away from them in general. Sports Finder mode. I don't really use this camera for sports, so I leave that off. Pre-shot, I also leave it off, but it might be interesting to you if you're actually in a sports situation. Self-timer mode, definitely useful if you need to be away from the camera and you need a few seconds to be able to shoot a picture. Interval shooting, so if you want to do time lapses, this is the menu to actually go into. It's really nice to have this in the camera. Photometry, which is basically the camera weighing the light situation. I usually just set it at multi and just leave it there. Shutter type, this is an interesting one to go into. It's always set at just mechanical shutter, but I think the best one is actually mechanical plus electric. So it will use the mechanical shutter all the way up to 1/4000th of a second, which is the maximum for the shutter on this camera. And then it would go to electronic shutter, which means that you can actually take pictures at a higher shutter speed than what the mechanical shutter can actually provide. So this provides maximum flexibility. So I definitely recommend going with mechanical plus electronic. Flicker mode reductions, I do keep that off, but you might have a use for that. IS modes, this one's kind of interesting because there are a wide variety of features that you can actually use. If you want to turn it off, that means you're going to turn off optical image stabilization, which I don't think anybody actually ever does, but it does offer you maximum power savings. So if you're really desperate to eke out the last bit of life in your battery, you might actually turn this off. This essentially will turn off all image stabilization. The better option to go with is shoot only, which means when you have pressed down on your shutter button, that's when optical image stabilization will actually turn on. As for me, I personally like to keep it on continuous because when I'm actually framing my shot, I like to have my image stabilized. It just helps me with my shooting. But if you do want to have a power saving feature, then shoot only would definitely be very useful. And if you're really desperate, you can always just turn it right off. For ISO, I like to do ISO 3, and I like to set this all the way up to 6400. I am perfectly happy with having ISO noise all the way up to 6400. For some people, they would leave it at 32 because they don't want to have a whole lot of noise. For me and my purposes, 6400 is where I would like it. Minimum shutter speed, a lot of people set this at auto. I personally prefer to have it set to 1/30th of a second. I feel like anything below that, you start getting pretty sketchy, especially with prime lenses. So I go ahead and just set it there. I don't change anything with adapter settings because I don't use adapters. For wireless communications, just leave that alone unless you're actually using the wireless settings on your computer, in which case you will know what to do. All right, moving on to the flash. I actually change no settings here because I very rarely use any of the flash features. Now we're going to go ahead and move down to the movie settings. So here, it's actually kind of nice because Fuji actually made the defaults 4K at 30 frames per second at 100 megabytes. This is a really good setting for vlogging purposes. If you want the maximum quality, then definitely bump it up to 200 megabytes per second. But for my purposes, 30 frames at 100 megabytes works just fine for me. Full HD, which is basically slow motion. You can actually select one of these if you want to do slow motion, but I actually like to set that particular feature up onto this function button up top. We can talk about that a little bit later. For film simulations, I personally prefer Astia for all of my vlogging needs because it's really nice on the skin tones. I find Velvia to be a little bit overly dramatic, and Classic Chrome or Provia, I find it to be a little bit too, I don't know, bright and a little bit undersaturated. So for me, I just like Astia. That's my preferred one for all of my vlogging purposes. White balance, I do leave it at auto most of the times unless I'm doing it in a studio setting, in which case I will actually set a specific white balance. Like right now on my X-T30, I have this set at a specific white balance. For dynamic range, there is no auto setting here, so you're going to have to pick one. I usually by default leave it at 100, but if I know I'm going to be shooting at a low light situation, I go ahead and just bump it up to 400% to give me a little bit more dynamic range. But it's your preference there. 100 is fine for almost every situation. Highlights, shadows, colors, and sharpness, noise reduction, I keep all those at the defaults. If I have to do anything with the actual image, I'll go ahead and do it in post. A lot of filmmakers actually like to reduce these settings, but for my purposes, I'm very happy with just having it at 0. Inner frame NR, go ahead and leave that off. F-log, which is flat image recording, I leave that off. Spherical light correction, which is basically lens correction, definitely keep that on. It will help you out. Movie AF mode, I definitely go with area because I like to be able to actually choose the area that I'm focusing on. So that is something that's really big for me. So I definitely change that into area focus instead of multi-focus. AFC custom settings, I definitely just leave those alone. Although if you don't like how quickly things are tracking, you can definitely come in here and tweak that, but I'm pretty fine with the tracking sensitivity and also the autofocus speeds, but definitely tweak it if you don't like it. Eye and face detect, I definitely have that on, and I definitely have it to where it's just eye off, so it just detects my face. I don't really need for it to track my eye when I'm actually vlogging. I just want to make sure that it actually tracks my face. Again, just like I did with photography, I definitely like the red high. It makes it very easy to see when I'm actually in manual focus. Focus check, I keep it off. HDMI display output, I keep that off because most of the time I don't have a monitor hooked up. But if you want to see information go out through the HDMI port, then you definitely want to turn that on. These output settings, like I said, I don't really hook a monitor up to my X-T30, so I just leave those at the defaults. 4K output via HDMI, that's usually pretty good, but for the most part, like I said, I don't really bother changing any of those settings. Zebra settings, I definitely turn those on. Zebras are super useful, and I usually turn this all the way up to 100%, which means I only want to see zebras when I'm actually losing color information. It just makes things a whole lot easier to look at. Audio settings is definitely something super important, but in order to adjust those, you're going to have to go into the movie mode up here just to make sure that you actually do that. That way you'll actually be able to adjust these two settings. If you have it in any of the picture taking modes, these two settings will be grayed out. So for the internal one, you definitely want to set it manually, and what you want to do is you want it to be in a quiet spot, and you want to see how much noise it's picking up. So I'm going to be quiet, and I'm going to go ahead and adjust my internal mics. So as you can see right here, when I was actually being very quiet, it wasn't picking up any noise. That's the noise floor that you definitely want to set to. This is going to ensure that you get your cleanest settings, but if you do have it set to a lower dB, what you're most likely going to have to do later on in post is you're going to have to boost the audio. The external one, you actually have to turn on to your external mic, but it's probably going to be somewhere similar to what it was set for the internal one. So by default, I'll set it to around -6 dB, and then I'll adjust it based on the mic that I'm using. But since I don't have a mic inserted into this one, I'm just going to show you an example of it. For mic level, for wind filter, and low cut filter, I actually like to turn all of this stuff off because I like to control this stuff in post. One of the reasons why I say this is because I don't want this to be baked into my audio file. I much rather do it in post because I feel like I have better control of it, and also I think the tools are going to be a lot better. I don't think the camera itself is really good at these type of functions, so I'll go ahead and just turn these off, and I'll just handle it during post processing. Headphone volumes, I usually turn this up to 9. You can go up to all the way to 10 if you want, but that's just my personal preference. And then right here you can say if it's a mic or a remote. For the purposes of this video, it's obviously the mic. Time code, this is only if you're actually recording something with time code. I personally don't have a use for that, so I don't really go into that setting. Tally light, this is something that's super useful to me for vlogging. I definitely have the front light on so that when I'm actually vlogging or when I'm filming myself, I can actually see when the camera is recording. Movie silent mode, I don't really use silent mode, so I just leave that off and just leave it alone. All right, we finally got down to the last menu, and this one is actually super long, so there's actually a lot of stuff to do in here. There's a lot of stuff packed into here, but this is where you can format your SD card, which is super important. Other than that, there's also some sound and flash things that you can turn on and off if you choose so. You can also customize your own My Menu settings, which means you can add specific things to your My Menu, which would show up at the very bottom here, but I generally don't need to change anything. For sound settings, I like to have a silent camera, so I actually end up turning almost all of these things off so that there is no beeping involved. This is just my personal preference. If you like the audible beeps, then definitely keep it on. For playback, especially for movies, again, I turn it all the way up to either 9 or 10 because it's usually very quiet. Screen setups, the EVA, so the eye cup, I generally like to turn that into manual. The reason why I say to do that is because you don't want it to adjust in brightness, because then you don't know if your picture is going to be overexposed or underexposed. I'd rather have it one consistent brightness, and I can determine whether or not the pictures that I'm taking is either overly bright or overly dark. For EVA color, for adjustments, LCD brightness, color adjustments, I leave those all at the default settings. You can adjust those if you want, but you're going to have to be really careful with those, because if you shift those colors around and you don't know what you're doing, you're going to end up making some really bad judgments on the pictures you take. So I just personally leave those at the default settings. Image display, I keep that off. I don't really want the picture that I just took to be displayed. That's my personal preference. Auto rotation, so if you go vertical with your camera, the menus will actually go vertical. That's super useful to keep on there. Exposure and white balance modes, I keep those at the defaults. Natural view, keep those off. I like to have the rule of thirds grid, so I go ahead and keep those at the default settings. Auto rotate PB, I keep that off. Focus scaling, if you're a metric person, then you can just keep it metric. We're in the US, so I'm pretty used to feet. T numbers, when you're actually working with cine lenses, that's perfectly fine with me. But if you prefer S-stops, you can definitely go to f-stop, but not something I worry about. Custom display, so this is where all of this information is being displayed. This is like a super important menu. So in here, so for custom display, I definitely have the framing guide turned on. Electronics turned on. Focus framing, I'm good with that. Histogram, definitely want to turn that on. Shooting modes, there is a bunch of stuff in here, but I like to turn that off. I like to turn the flash off. You definitely want to go in here and really work through what you want. Touchscreen mode, I actually turn that off because when I'm vlogging, I accidentally touch the screen a whole lot. I personally don't like to have the touchscreen on, but that's personal preference. A lot of people do like to have the touchscreen on, but you can make that decision in here. There's definitely a lot that you can turn on and off, but those are the general things that I turn on. And what you'll see is that now I have my auto level in here. And if I take off the lens, you can see the rule of third guidelines in here. So super useful setting to actually go through. Again, this is going to be in the wrench settings and in the screen setup. And if you go all the way down to the bottom, it's in the display custom settings. So there's a lot of useful things that you can turn on and off in here. So definitely look at it. Large indicators. A lot of people like to have large indicators either in their eye cup or on the LCD display. I personally like to keep them small because I can fit more icons onto the screen. So I keep all of those the same. Buttons and dials. This is actually another super important one. The lever settings, I personally keep those on, or basically keep them at defaults. The function settings, this is one of the super important ones. If you go in here, This will basically tell you all of the custom buttons and what they do, so definitely look through that. I personally like to have my slow motions assigned to this button, and then with the one right below it, this one right here, I usually like to assign this one to be face detect on and off. Whatever you like to assign, you can do it in here. Command dials, this is where you change what your command dial does. I personally leave these at the defaults because they work fine, but there is a limited number of settings that you can change here. I personally don't change anything in there. Shutter AF, shutter AE, I personally keep those at the default. The next two options, shoot without a lens and shoot without an SD card, I personally prefer to have these off because when there is no lens on the camera and also when there's no SD card on there, I just feel like the camera doesn't really need to take pictures. So for me, I actually just like to have both these features off. Focus ring, it's whatever your preference is. Focus ring operation, I like this to be linear because like non-linear, it always messes with me. I just want something that's predictable, which means the linear settings is probably what you want to go with. For these two buttons, for this particular camera, I usually just leave it at the default. Aperture ring settings, leave it at auto. For touchscreen settings, I go ahead and put the touchscreens to off because I just like to have my touchscreens off. That's my personal preference, but if you actually like to have your touchscreen on, then definitely keep those on. That's just my personal preference. And then we go into the last menu, which is the auto power off. The default is 2 minutes, which I think is pretty fair. And then performance mode, whether or not you want to be in boost mode or not. For this particular video, I have it in boost mode just so that the screen doesn't dim. But for the most part, when I'm actually out using the camera, I usually have it in just normal mode. But for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to keep it on. Saving data settings. This is where if you actually want to change the folder names and also how you want files to be written onto your SD card. So I just leave all of those at the defaults just because there's nothing really interesting to change in here. And then the final thing, which is connection settings. This is if you're going to be using wireless and Bluetooth. For the most part, I keep everything off because I want to save maximum battery life. And I really don't like connecting my camera to my phones because it's just a waste of power for me. And if you actually like having auto image transfers, then definitely turn those on and pair it with your phone. Just realize that it's just going to be a little bit draining on your batteries, but overall could be very useful to you. But for the most part, I just keep those off. And that right there is a super quick rundown, even though this is probably going to be a pretty long video, of the entire menu settings. If you have any specific questions, just leave it in the comments below. But for the most part, people's attention spans on YouTube are pretty short anyway, so I try to run through this as quickly as I can. Like I said, if you have any specific questions, please leave in the comments below, and I will go through every one of them, and I will do my best to answer every one of them. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.